The morning Bernard Boone rode into Harlan Creek with fire in his eyes and his jaw set like iron. Not a single soul in that dusty little town would have wagered he would still be standing on the schoolhouse steps come sundown, let alone that he would be standing there with his hat in his hands and something altogether unfamiliar softening the hard planes of his face. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle wore October like a crown of rust and gold. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed burning amber against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had grown up fast and rough, the way most settlements did out on the high plains, with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that saw more trouble than the sheriff cared to admit, and a church that doubled as the social hall on Saturday nights. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of the main street, a neat white-painted building that stood out against the surrounding scrub and red clay like something from a different world entirely, which in a sense it was. Bernard Boone was 34 years old, and he had the look of a man who had spent the better part of those years working harder than God ever intended. He was broad through the shoulders, with hands that were more scar than smooth skin, and a face that the sun and the wind had turned the color of old saddle leather. He had owned the Boone Ranch, 6 miles south of town, for going on 9 years, and he had built every inch of it himself, first with borrowed money and then with the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that most men around those parts simply called being a Boone. He was respected in Harlan Creek. Not always liked, but respected. There was a difference, and Bernard had long since made his peace with it. What Bernard had not made his peace with was the letter he had received 3 days prior, forwarded from the school board in the town of Mesquite, informing him that his son, Thomas, age 9, had been written up twice in the past fortnight for fighting on school grounds. The letter had been signed by the new schoolteacher, one Clara Ford, and it had been written in a hand so precise and deliberate it felt like a reproach all on its own. Bernard had read it twice, folded it into his breast pocket, and said nothing to anyone about it for 3 full days. Then he had saddled his horse, Buck, at 6:30 in the morning, ridden into Harlan Creek, and tied the animal to the post outside the schoolhouse with the kind of energy that made the horse shift nervously against his lead. Thomas was not a bad boy. Bernard knew that with the certainty of a man who had raised the child largely on his own since the boy was 4 years old, since the fever had taken a leaner in the winter of 1873, leaving Bernard with a ranch, a mountain of grief, and a small, solemn child who looked so much like his mother that some mornings it was all Bernard could do to get out of bed. Thomas had his mother's dark eyes and her way of going still when he was thinking hard about something, and he had his father's stubbornness, which was saying a considerable amount. He was not bad, but he was lonely, and lonely boys in rough country sometimes expressed that loneliness with their fists, and Bernard knew it, and it shamed him because he had not known what to do about it. But that was not the thought in his head as he climbed the 2 steps to the schoolhouse door and gripped the handle. The thought in his head was simpler and less kind. He was going to collect his son and bring him home because he needed Thomas at the ranch this week. There was fencing down along the south pasture and the hands he usually relied on had taken work elsewhere. And if the boy was going to be causing trouble at school anyway, then he might as well be of some use at home. That was what Bernard told himself, standing on that step, reaching for the door. The door opened before he touched it. She was not what he expected. He was not sure what he had expected precisely. The previous schoolteacher had been a man named Mr. Holt, a dry and dusty fellow of about 50 who smelled of pipe tobacco and had the personality of a fence post. Bernard had prepared himself for something similar, or perhaps for some severe-faced woman in her middle years with spectacles and a ruler. What he had not prepared himself for was the young woman who pulled open the schoolhouse door with the kind of purposeful confidence that made it immediately clear she had been watching him walk up the steps, had measured his expression and his stride, and had decided to get ahead of whatever he was planning. Clara Ford was 28 years old, though she looked younger and felt older, in the way of people who have thought carefully about most things. She had deep auburn hair pinned up neatly at the back of her head, and green eyes the color of creek water after rain, sharp and clear, and not the least bit intimidated by the large, scowling man standing on her threshold. She was holding a piece of chalk in one hand and a primer in the other, and she stood in the doorway with her shoulders square and her chin level, blocking his path as effectively as if she had been a barn door. "Mr. Boone," she said, and her voice was level and warm at the same time, which was a combination he had not encountered before. "I was wondering when you would come." Bernard blinked. He had been ready for a confrontation, had the words arranged in his head like fence posts in a line, but she had spoken first and she had spoken his name, and the whole line of posts shifted sideways. "Miss Ford," he said after a moment. "I imagine you received my letter," she said. She did not move out of the doorway. "I did," he said. "That is what I have come to discuss. I would like to speak with Thomas." "Thomas is in the middle of his arithmetic lesson," she said pleasantly. "He is doing very well today, as it happens. I would hate to interrupt his concentration." Bernard's jaw tightened. "Miss Ford, with respect, I am the boy's father, and I will speak with him when I choose." "You will speak with him at noon recess," she said, and she smiled when she said it, which took the sting out of the words without diminishing their firmness one bit. "And in the meantime, I would be grateful if you would sit with me for a few minutes, Mr. Boone, because there are some things I would like you to understand about your son before you do whatever it is you are planning." He stared at her. In 9 years of dealing with ranch hands, cattle buyers, bankers, and the various difficult men of the Texas Panhandle, very few people had ever spoken to him quite like that, with that particular blend of respect and unmistakable intention. He did not know whether to be angry or impressed, and the uncertainty of it rooted him to the step. "You are not going to move out of that doorway, are you?" he said. It was not really a question. "Not until you agree to sit down," she said, and the smile was still there, slight and genuine. Bernard Boone, against every instinct and prior plan, took off his hat. She let him in. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of children's lunches packed in cloth sacks, apples and cornbread and dried jerky. The students, 12 of them ranging in age from 6 to 14, looked up at the large man entering their classroom with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity of children, and Bernard scanned the rows of benches until he found Thomas, who was sitting in the second row with a pencil gripped too hard, and his dark eyes wide with something that was halfway between alarm and hope. Bernard gave the boy a single nod, which Thomas returned with a nod of his own, and then Clara Ford was directing Bernard to a chair near the back of the room, the one that presumably the adults used when they visited, and pressing a cup of coffee into his hands from the small iron stove in the corner. "We have a brief recess in 20 minutes, she said quietly, settling into the chair beside him rather than returning to the front of the room. "I have left them reading passages. They are old enough to manage for a little while." Bernard looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. Up close she was even less what he had expected, which was starting to become a theme of this morning. There was a small ink stain on the inside of her left wrist, and a few strands of auburn hair had come loose at her temple, and she was looking at him with those green eyes in a way that managed to be both patient and searching. "You said you had things you wanted me to understand," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the children. "I do," she said. She folded her hands in her lap. "Thomas has been fighting. That is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. The first incident was with a boy named Caleb Marsh, who is 13. Caleb said something unkind about Thomas's mother." The air in the room went very still, or perhaps it was only the air around Bernard that went still. He looked at her steadily. "What did he say?" "He said that Thomas didn't have a mother because no woman would stay with a man as hard and cold as his father." She said it plainly without softening it because she had the sense that this man was not someone who wanted to be handled. "Thomas hit him. I'm not excusing the fighting, Mr. Boone, but I thought you should know what preceded it." Bernard set the coffee cup down with careful precision. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and threw their shadows against the schoolhouse windows. "And the second time. A boy named Pete Garvey called Thomas a ranch brat and said his arithmetic was stupid," she said. "Thomas broke Pete's slate over his own knee and then tried to hit Pete with the pieces." She paused. "Thomas was angrier about the arithmetic remark than the ranch brat remark, which I found rather telling." Bernard looked at her sharply. "Telling how?" "It told me that Thomas cares very deeply about being thought well of," she said. "About being seen as capable and intelligent, which he is, Mr. Boone. He is one of the sharpest children I have taught, and I do not say that lightly. He reads 2 years ahead of where he should, and his understanding of numbers is genuinely remarkable for his age." She leaned forward slightly, and the morning light through the window caught the green of her eyes and made them almost luminous. "He is a good boy who is carrying something very heavy and does not know where to put it down. I thought you should know that before you came in here, and frightened him into silence about all of it." Bernard felt the words land somewhere central and undefended in him, felt them settle into a place he generally kept locked and did not examine, and something shifted in his chest, something that had been fixed in a particular tight position for a very long time. "I was not planning to frighten him," he said, though even as he said it he wondered if it were entirely true. "No," she said, and her voice was gentle now. "I don't imagine you were. But you came in here angry, and children read the anger before they read the intention." He looked at his hands. The scar on his right palm from a fence wire in the winter of '76 curved like a crescent. He thought about Thomas's face when he had come through the door, that expression that was halfway between alarm and hope. He thought about the fact that hope had been there at all, and felt the knowledge of it like a bruise. "I received your letter," he said again, and this time the words came out differently, less like an accusation. "I thought I would come and take him home for the week. There is work at the ranch." "He is 9 years old," she said, not unkindly. "I know how old he is," he said. "He needs to be here," she said. "Not because of the rules, though the rules matter, but because this is the one place where he gets to be a child who is learning, rather than a child who is helping. There is time enough for the ranch work. There is only so much time for what we do here." Bernard looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, without performing confidence, because she simply had it, the quiet bedrock kind that was not about being unafraid but about having decided what she believed and standing on it. "You are not from here," he said. It was not an insult. It was an observation. "I am from Missouri," she said. "I taught in St. Joseph for 3 years before I came west." She paused. "I came west because the school board in St. Joseph had very firm opinions about what a young woman of my age should be doing with her life, and those opinions were not teaching." "What were they?" he asked, and he was surprised to find he genuinely wanted to know. Something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been amusement or might have been an older, quieter feeling. "Getting married," she said. "Keeping house. Which are fine things, Mr. Boone, and I have nothing against them. But they were not the things I was called to do, not then, not yet, and I was not willing to give up the thing I was called to do simply because someone else thought it was time." He nodded slowly. He understood something about that, about the stubborn refusal to let other people's timelines govern your life. He had been told, after Alina died, that he should sell the ranch, that a man alone could not manage it and a boy at the same time, that he should go back to his family in Georgia, that he should hire a housekeeper who would inevitably become something more. He had done none of those things. He had stayed and he had built and he had raised his son, and most days he believed he had done right by both of them, but there were other days, quieter days, when he sat on the porch after Thomas was in bed and listened to the wind coming down off the Llano Estacado and felt the weight of everything he might have given Thomas if only he had known how. "Miss Ford," he said. "Yes. I will come back at noon recess," he said, "if the invitation stands." She looked at him and the slight smile returned, and it was not a smile of victory which he appreciated. "The invitation stands, Mr. Boone." He put his hat back on and walked out of the schoolhouse and stood on the step for a moment in the cool October air, listening to her voice drifting back through the open door as she returned to the front of the room and called the children's attention back from wherever it had wandered. He stood there for longer than he needed to, listening to the sound of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular, disorienting sensation of being interested. He did not go far. He tied Buck more securely, visited the general store and bought a sack of flour and a coil of baling wire he needed anyway. And then, because the morning had arranged itself strangely, and he was not ready to simply ride back to the ranch and pretend none of it had happened, he sat on the bench outside the store and turned his hat in his hands and thought. He thought about Thomas, about the expression on the boy's face, about what it meant that Thomas had struck another child for saying that no woman would stay with Bernard. He thought about how much the boy had been carrying in that quiet, watchful way of his, and how little Bernard had done to make the load lighter because he had not known it was there, or he had known and not wanted to look directly at it. He thought about a leaner, which he rarely let himself do anymore because grief in a man like Bernard was a practical problem as much as an emotional one. It interfered with the work, and so he had built a wall around it the way he built walls around everything, efficiently and without ceremony. He thought about Clara Ford. There was no good reason to think about her. She was his son's teacher. She had stopped him at her door and redirected his morning entirely and told him, with extraordinary calm, several things he did not want to hear and had needed to hear, and then she had given him coffee and told him to come back at noon. It was a very efficient morning's work on her part. He did not know what he had expected, standing on that step. He did not know what he was feeling now, sitting on this bench. He only knew that the October light was very clear, and the air smelled of dust and cedar and possibility, and that he would be back at the schoolhouse at noon, and he was not entirely certain that was only about Thomas. At 12 o'clock, Bernard was at the schoolhouse steps when the door opened, and the children came tumbling out into the yard, shrieking and laughing and immediately dissolving into whatever complicated social dramas children carried around with them. Thomas came out in the second wave, more measured than the others, and spotted his father immediately. He walked across the yard with his chin up, which was so purely Bernard's own manner of carrying himself that it struck Bernard somewhere between the eyes. "Papa," Thomas said. "Son," Bernard said. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular awkwardness of two people who loved each other entirely and were not at all sure how to say so. "Are you taking me home?" Thomas asked. His voice was steady, but Bernard saw the thing under the steadiness. "No," Bernard said, and watched Thomas's shoulders drop about half an inch with relief he was trying hard not to show. "I came to talk to you. Are you going to sit with me?" They sat together on the school steps, and Bernard put his elbows on his knees the way he always did when he was about to say something that mattered, and Thomas did the same thing, which neither of them noticed. Bernard told Thomas that he had heard about the fights, and that he understood why the first one had happened, and that fighting was not the answer even when the thing someone said was wrong and hurtful and untrue. Thomas listened, and when Bernard got to the part about what Caleb Marsh had said, the boy went very still in that a leaner way, and Bernard reached over and put a hand on the back of his neck in the only gesture of comfort he had ever really been able to manage, and felt Thomas lean almost imperceptibly into it. "Caleb Marsh is ignorant," Bernard said. "What he said was ignorant, and it was cruel, and I know it hurt you." "It made me mad," Thomas said quietly. "I know," Bernard said. "It made me mad too when I heard it." Thomas looked at him sideways. "You're not going to make me apologize to Caleb, are you?" "I am going to make you apologize to Pete Garvey for breaking his slate," Bernard said, "because Pete's family is not wealthy and that slate was not free. As for Caleb Marsh, I am going to speak to his father." Thomas absorbed this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who understood that his father did not make statements he did not intend to keep. "Miss Ford says I should write an essay about conflict resolution," he said, with the tone of someone reporting a sentence handed down by a judge. "Miss Ford seems like someone whose suggestions you should take seriously," Bernard said. Something changed in Thomas's expression, a slight brightening. "She's not like Mr. Holt," he said. "She actually explains things, and she doesn't smell like pipe tobacco." "That is a recommendation in her favor," Bernard agreed. Thomas looked at him with those dark, leaner eyes, and something in them was probing gently at something. "She's pretty," Thomas said, with the transparency of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle. "Write the essay," Bernard said. Thomas grinned, which was such an unexpected expression on his son's usually solemn face that Bernard felt it like sunlight. "Yes, sir," Thomas said, and got up and ran back toward the other children, and Bernard sat on the step alone for a moment before he became aware that the door behind him had opened quietly. "How did that go?" Clara asked. She sat down on the step beside him, which was a forward thing to do, and she probably knew it, but the frankness of it fit with everything else about her, and he found he didn't mind. "Better than I expected," he said. "He is going to write the essay." "I know," she said, and he heard the smile in her voice without looking at her. "I could hear some of what you said, not much, just enough to know you handled it well." He was not used to being told he handled things well. He was used to being told he handled things efficiently or firmly or without waste. Well was different. Well implied something about the manner of the thing, not just the outcome. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him and he looked back, and the October sun was making gold out of the strands of hair at her temple. "For what?" she asked. "For arriving at your door in the state I arrived in," he said. "I had decided what the situation was before I had any information about it." "You were worried about your son," she said. "That is not a thing to apologize for." "I was going to pull him out of school," he said. "I know," she said. "You were also going to change your mind, I thought." He turned to look at her fully, and she was already looking at him with that steady, clear regard, and he felt again that particular disorientation of being in the presence of someone who saw things accurately and was not unkind about it. "You thought that?" he asked. "I thought that you were a man who, once shown something clearly, would see it," she said. "I was right." Bernard looked out at the children in the yard, found Thomas among them playing some sort of complicated game that involved a stick and a great deal of running and shouting. The boy was laughing. Genuinely laughing, with his head thrown back, and it was a sound Bernard did not hear often enough and felt like something unlocking in the center of his chest when he heard it. "He needs this," Bernard said, meaning the school, meaning the children, meaning whatever it was Clara Ford had made of this small white building on the edge of the Panhandle. "He does," she agreed. "He also needs his father, not the barn, not the fences, not the cattle, his father, the man sitting on this step." Bernard was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. A hawk circled high and slow over the creek. "His mother died when he was 4, Bernard said. It was not something he said to people. He stated facts of it when necessary, the way you stated any historical fact, but he did not generally volunteer it, and especially not to someone he had met less than 2 hours ago. The words surprised him coming out. "I know," she said, very gently. "Thomas told me. He talks about her sometimes. He says she made the best cornbread in the county and that she could whistle like a mockingbird." Bernard felt something happen behind his eyes that he was absolutely not going to permit in front of his son's schoolteacher on a Tuesday morning in October, and he looked at the hawk instead of at her, and breathed steadily until the feeling passed. "She could," he said. "Drove me half to distraction with it sometimes." He heard Clara laugh, soft and genuine, and it was a sound as warm as the fire on the schoolhouse stove. "He misses her," she said. "But he loves you very much, Mr. Boone, very much indeed. It comes off him in waves whenever he talks about you." Bernard put his hat on. It gave him something to do with his hands. "I'm not always sure I deserve that," he said, which was more honesty than he had intended to offer. "No one ever does," she said simply. That is rather the nature of love. He stood up and she stood with him, and they were close enough that he could see the ink stain on her wrist and the slight asymmetry of her smile, one corner a fraction higher than the other. The children were beginning to drift back toward the schoolhouse door, recess ending as naturally as it had begun. Thomas caught his father's eye from across the yard and raised a hand in farewell, and Bernard raised his in return. "He will be fine here, Mr. Boone," Clara said. "I know," Bernard said. "Miss Ford." He nodded, she nodded. He went down the steps and untied Buck and swung up into the saddle, and when he looked back at the schoolhouse, she was ushering the last of the children through the door, and she did not look back, which for reasons he could not have articulated at that moment, he found oddly encouraging. He rode home with the wind at his back and the October sun warming his shoulders, and something he had not carried in years sitting lightly and unfamiliar somewhere around his sternum. He came back on Thursday. He did not have a reason for it, not a strong one. He told himself he was coming to check on Thomas's progress with the essay, which was thin reasoning and he knew it, but he was a man who believed in doing things rather than analyzing them too much, and so he saddled Buck on Thursday morning and rode into town. He tied up at the post and climbed the steps and knocked this time, which felt like the appropriate thing to do on a second visit. She opened the door and looked at him without surprise, which told him something, and said, "Mr. Boone. The children are in the middle of geography. Would you like to wait on the step or would you like to come in?" "I will wait on the step," he said, "if that is acceptable." "It is," she said. He sat on the step in the morning sunshine and could hear her voice through the open window, clear and patient, tracing the Colorado River across a map he imagined was pinned to the wall, asking the children to think about why rivers mattered, where people built their towns, what water meant out here on the high plains. He could hear Thomas's voice among the others, answering a question about irrigation, and the precision of the answer made Bernard straighten slightly with a pride he had not known he was holding. When the noon recess came and the children spilled out, Thomas saw his father on the step and said, with supreme nonchalance, "Oh, you are here again." And Bernard said, equally casual, "I had business in town." And Thomas looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes and said, "The general store was closed on Thursday this month because Mr. Ellery is visiting his sister in Amarillo." And Bernard had nothing to say to that. Which was the moment Clara Ford arrived at the door and saved him by asking Thomas to go and help the younger children with their lunch while she spoke with his father. Thomas went, smiling with one side of his mouth exactly the way his father did, and Clara sat down beside Bernard on the step again and said, "You did not have business in town." "No," Bernard said. "I see," she said, and folded her hands and looked out at the yard. She was wearing a blue dress today, a practical one with a white collar, and the blue made her eyes look more like Deep Creek water than before. "I wanted to ask whether Thomas had made any progress with the essay," he said, which was technically true. "He finished it this morning," she said. It was 4 pages long and argued, quite compellingly, that the best resolution to conflict was open communication and that fighting should be reserved for situations involving genuine physical threat. He cited the cattle wars of '77 as an example of what happened when communication broke down. She paused. "He is going to be a formidable man someday, your son." Bernard felt the pride again, deeper this time. "He is already formidable," he said. She smiled. "He is. He gets it from somewhere." He looked at her sidelong. "Missouri, perhaps." She laughed genuinely, and the sound of it went all the way through him. "I was not aware that formidable was a Missouri quality," she said. "I imagine it is an everywhere quality," he said. "In certain people." The silence that settled between them then was a comfortable one, which was notable because Bernard did not generally find silences with people comfortable. He found them something to be waited out, spaces between transactions. This one felt like something else, like the quiet of a Sunday morning, like the moment before a storm, like something that had its own meaning without needing to be filled. "Why did you really come west?" he asked. Not the school board answer, which had been true but was not the whole truth, he suspected. He had told her things this morning without intending to, and the reciprocity of that felt like an important question. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved a lock of hair across her cheek and she pushed it back with one finger. "My husband died," she said, 2 years ago in the winter. A fever like so many things out here. We had been married 14 months. He was a good man. His name was James." She said it simply and without performance, the way Bernard had said the facts about Alina, the wall around grief that both of them had built and both of them were, it seemed, slowly finding doorways in. After James died, staying in St. Joseph felt like trying to live inside a memory. I needed somewhere new, somewhere I could be something other than James Ford's widow. The position here was advertised, and I applied, and here I am. "Here you are," Bernard said. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that was not yet named but had the weight and shape of something that would be named soon. "I am sorry about your husband," he said. "I am sorry about your wife," she said. They sat in the October afternoon and watched the children play, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was enough. He came back the following Tuesday, and then the Thursday after that. And then on a Saturday he came not to the school but to the church social, where the whole of Harlan Creek came together to celebrate the end of the corn harvest with fiddle music and potluck supper, and the kind of communal warmth that was all the more precious for being so hard-won in a place that spent most of the year being harsh and uncompromising. He told himself he was coming because Thomas would be there, and because Marta Ellery always made a sweet potato pie that was worth riding 6 miles for, and none of that was untrue. But when he walked through the church hall door and scanned the room and found her almost immediately, standing near the window talking with the minister's wife and laughing at something, the relief of finding her there told him something about why he had really come. She saw him across the room, and her expression did something subtle and immediate. Not a performance of pleasure, just the genuine involuntary thing that happened when a face saw something it had been hoping to see. She excused herself and came across the room toward him and said, "Mr. Boone," and he said, "Miss Ford," and they both understood that the formality had become a kind of private joke, a shorthand for the distance they were both still maintaining out of habit and propriety, and the general caution of people who had lost someone and were not in any hurry to be careless with their hearts again. "Thomas is by the pie table," she said. "Thomas is always by the pie table," he said. She smiled. "Would you like to dance?" He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The fiddle is starting," she said, which was true. Old Pete Harkins in the corner was drawing his bow across the strings in the warm-up way he had, the familiar 3 notes. "And I would like to dance, and you are the person I would like to dance with. So I am asking." Bernard Boone, who had not danced since the winter of 1872, said yes. He was not a graceful dancer. He was too large and too careful, and the first 30 seconds were a negotiation between where he thought his feet should be and where they apparently wanted to go. But Clara fit against his arm with such natural ease, and the music was the warm and energetic kind that forgave mistakes. And after the first minute, he stopped thinking about his feet and started thinking about her hand in his hand, and the way she moved, confident and light, and the way she kept her eyes on his face rather than the floor, as though she were navigating by him. "You are going to step on my foot," she said cheerfully. "I might," he agreed. "That is all right," she said. "I have been stepped on before." He did not step on her foot. He came close twice, and both times she adjusted without comment, which was a small grace that he noticed and appreciated. Thomas materialized at the edge of the dancing area at some point during the second reel, holding a plate with 2 slices of sweet potato pie on it, and watched his father dance with his teacher with an expression of profound satisfaction that he was making absolutely no effort to conceal. When Bernard caught his eye, Thomas raised one of the pie plates in a toast and turned away, whistling, and Bernard would have been more irritated about it if he had not been, in some fundamental way, deeply happy. After the dancing, they sat together at one of the long tables and ate their supper alongside half the town, and the conversation ranged over everything and nothing. the way conversation does when two people are genuinely curious about each other and have a great deal of catching up to do. He told her about building the ranch, about the first winter when the cattle had been hit by a blizzard and he had lost a quarter of the herd and had spent 3 days in the snow digging out the ones he could save. She told him about teaching in St. Joseph, about the particular challenge and joy of the children who came from difficult homes and needed school to be a refuge rather than just a place of learning. He told her about Thomas learning to ride at age 5, about the horse that had been too large for him, and the stubborn way the boy had gotten back on it every single time it threw him. She told him about arriving in Harlan Creek in August with 2 trunks and a box of books, and being met at the wagon by the school board chairman, who had taken one look at her and said, "You're younger than we expected." And she had said, "And you are exactly as I expected," which had not started the relationship on the warmest possible footing. Bernard laughed at that, a full and genuine laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did the people at neighboring tables who turned to look at him, because Bernard Boone laughing fully at a social was not something most of them had witnessed before. She looked at him when he laughed, and the expression on her face was not triumphant or amused at the novelty of it. It was something quieter, something that looked a great deal like caring. On the way home that night, Thomas sat on the saddle in front of Bernard, the way he had as a smaller child, which he was getting too old for but which neither of them was willing to acknowledge, and said, into the dark and the stars and the wide flat Texas sky, "Are you going to court Miss Ford, Papa?" Bernard rode in silence for a moment. Buck's hooves were steady on the dry road. "That is a large question for this time of night," he said. "I think you should," Thomas said. "She makes you laugh." "You do not laugh much." Bernard put his arm a little tighter around the boy. "Since when did you become so wise?" "Miss Ford says I have a gift for reading people," Thomas said with immense satisfaction. "She says it is an important skill." "She is not wrong," Bernard said. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence under the stars, and when Bernard put Thomas to bed, he sat on the edge of the cot for a few minutes in the dark, listening to the boys breathing slow toward sleep, and thought about all the evenings he had sat here, exhausted and lonely and trying to be enough for the 2 of them, himself and his son, trying to be everything at once because there was no one else. He thought about what it might be like to not always be doing that alone. He did not sleep well, but for the first time in a long while it was not grief keeping him awake. It was something lighter, something with possibility in it. The following week, he asked Clara Ford if he might call on her on Sunday afternoon. She said yes. He came to the small house the school board provided for the teacher, a 2-room affair with a good stove, and a window box that she had planted with whatever would grow in October, which turned out to be late marigolds and a stubborn climbing vine she called a morning glory that the real Texas winter would eventually take, but for now burned with orange and purple against the gray boards of the house. He brought Thomas, because it would have been strange and somewhat inappropriate to come alone, and Thomas was delighted to be brought and pretended to be indifferent about it in a way that convinced no one. Clara had made coffee and a simple apple cake, and they sat in her small parlor, which was crowded with books to a degree that Bernard found entirely charming. Books stacked on every horizontal surface, dog-eared and annotated and clearly read rather than displayed. Thomas immediately discovered a book about the natural history of North American birds and curled up in the corner with it, which left Bernard and Clara at the small table by the window with their coffee cups and the afternoon light, and the October sky going pale gold through the wavy glass. They talked for 3 hours. He had not talked like this, he thought, since Alina, and even then it had been different. He and Alina had been young and had found each other early and had grown into talking the way people grow into a house, gradually, room by room. This was different. This was 2 people who had already grown, who had learned their shapes from hard experience and now found with some amazement that the shapes fit together. She told him about her parents in Missouri, her father a schoolteacher himself, her mother a woman who had read every book she could get her hands on and passed the habit to her daughter. She told him about James, more than she had at the school, about how they had met at a county fair, about how he had been a carpenter, good with his hands and easy in his spirit, about how the fever had taken him in 4 days, and she had sat with him through all 4 and come out the other side of it changed in the way that grief always changed you, the way that made certain things feel very clear and certain other things feel very far away. He told her about Alina the way he had not told anyone, not the facts of it but the texture of it, about how she had been the one who pushed him to buy the land when he had been full of doubt, about how she had a temper that came on fast and left just as fast, about how the house on the ranch had become a different thing entirely after she died, not a home but a structure, useful but not warm, and how he had spent 5 years making it functional and comfortable and had never quite managed to make it warm again. "It is warm now," Clara said. He looked at her. "Thomas told me about it," she said. "He says you have a parlor with a good rug and a window that faces south and catches the afternoon light, and that in the evenings you sit in the big chair and he sits on the floor and you read to each other." She paused. "That is warm, Mr. Boone. That is a warm house." He thought about that. He thought about Thomas on the floor with a book, and himself in the chair with his own, and the lamp making a circle of yellow light that held the two of them in it, and the wind outside and the warmth inside, and perhaps she was right. Perhaps he had been living in warmth for some time without recognizing it as such because he was the one inside it. "Bernard," he said. She looked at him, a question. "You could call me Bernard," he said, "if you like." The slight asymmetric smile appeared. "Bernard," she said, "I am Clara." "I know," he said. "I have been finding it difficult to call you that." "Why?" she asked. He considered the truth, which was that calling her by her given name felt like stepping across a threshold he had spent weeks approaching and not yet crossing. "Because you are formidable," he said, which made her laugh, and he decided that making her laugh was something he intended to pursue as a matter of some priority for as long as she was willing to be in his company. After that Sunday, things moved with a velocity that was somewhat surprising to both of them and entirely visible to the rest of Harlan Creek, which was the kind of town that noticed these things and had opinions about them. The opinions were mostly favorable, because Clara had made herself well liked in her months there, and because Bernard, while not the easiest man in the county, was a fair one, and the general feeling was that they were both good people who had been lonely for long enough and deserved whatever good had found them. There were dissenting opinions, as there always are. Caleb Marsh's father came to Bernard on a Thursday afternoon outside the livery, and said, with the kind of studied casualness that usually preceded the opposite of casualness, that he had heard Boone was spending a considerable amount of time with the schoolteacher, and it seemed odd to him that a man would get so wrapped up with a widow woman who had come from elsewhere and didn't know the land. Bernard looked at Walt Marsh for a long moment, with the expression that generally settled arguments fairly conclusively, and said, "Your son told my son, who is 9 years old, that no woman would stay with a man like me. I would like to know where your boy learned to think that way, because it did not arrive in his head from nothing." Walt Marsh went slightly red, and then Bernard said, "I am going to visit Clara Ford on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and as many Sundays as she will have me. You are welcome to disapprove, Walt. Most things worth doing attract disapproval from someone." He tipped his hat and walked away, and Walt Marsh found other things to be concerned about after that. November came to the Panhandle with the particular ferocity that November always managed in that part of Texas, a blue norther rolling down from the Oklahoma Territory, with 40-mile winds and temperatures that dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The first real cold of the season hit on a Wednesday, and Bernard rode in from checking the south fence line to find Thomas sick with it. Not dangerously so, but feverish and miserable in that 9-year-old way that made the world seem very large and the child in it very small. He sent word to the school with Hector, his most senior ranch hand, a quiet and reliable man from the Pecos country who had worked for Bernard for 6 years. And then he spent the day doing what he had done alone every time Thomas was sick, alternating between the sick room and the kitchen, making the willow bark tea that brought the fever down and the beef broth that Thomas refused but eventually drank, and the gentle but implacable insistence that the boy stay in bed and not attempt to ride any horses or move any fence posts or do any of the other things his particular variety of stubbornness suggested to him. On Thursday morning, Thomas was better, the fever broken and his appetite returning with the straightforwardly mercenary enthusiasm of a healthy boy's appetite, and it was Thomas, propped up in bed with a bowl of oatmeal, who said, "Did Miss Ford send a note?" "I would not know," Bernard said. "Hector said he might have mentioned where he was going when he was in town," Thomas said, with elaborate innocence. Hector, when located, confirmed that he had mentioned it to Mrs. Ellery at the general store, and that Miss Ford had heard about it, and that a covered dish and a note had been sent to the ranch via Hector that same afternoon and had somehow ended up on the kitchen table without being mentioned to Bernard, at which point Hector looked at some middle distance with the expression of a man who had absolutely no information about anything. The covered dish turned out to be a venison stew with cornbread on the side, and the note said, "I hope Thomas improves quickly. Please do not forget to rest yourself as well, Bernard. These things have a way of spreading when you are too tired to resist them. I will look for you both on Sunday if he is well enough." He read the note twice, standing in the kitchen in the gray November light. Then he put it in the same pocket where he had put her letter the first time, the one that had sent him to her door. He thought there was a symmetry to that. Thomas recovered fully by Saturday, announced himself fighting fit, helped mend 2 sections of fence in the south pasture, and ate enough at supper for a grown man and a half, all of which Bernard took as a favorable prognosis. On Sunday, he loaded them both into the wagon rather than on horseback, because the roads were muddy from the first real rain of the cold season, and they drove into town with Thomas in high spirits and Bernard in the particular state of composed anticipation that was the closest he generally got to being visibly excited about anything. Clara met them at the door of her house and said to Thomas, "You look entirely recovered," and Thomas said, "I was never really that sick," and Clara said, "Your father's note said you had a fever of 101, and Thomas had the grace to look slightly abashed." She had made a roast chicken, which filled the small house with warmth and the smell of rosemary, and the 3 of them ate together at her table, with the November wind throwing itself against the windows, and the lamp making everything amber and close. And Bernard thought, sitting there with Clara's voice and Thomas's voice weaving together in that particular easy way they had developed over the months, that this was what warm felt like from the inside. He had been right that the ranch house had warmth. But it was a narrower warmth than this. This was wider. This had room for more. After Thomas had been settled with his book in the corner and the dishes cleared and the second cup of coffee poured, Bernard looked at Clara across the table and said quietly, "I have been thinking." "About what?" she asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a habit he had when he was choosing words carefully. "About Thomas," he said. "About the ranch. About the fact that I have been riding into town on any pretense I can manufacture, and that you appear to know every time that the pretense is thin and you let me in anyway." "I do know," she said, matching his quiet tone. "I am not a man who is good at making speeches," he said. "I am a man who is better with actions than with words, and I am aware that is not always a virtue." He looked at her, and she was watching him with those clear green eyes, and he did not look away from it. "I am asking you, Clara, whether you would consider letting me court you properly. Not Sunday visits and Saturday dances, but properly, with the understanding that I have intentions and the intentions are serious." The November wind pressed against the glass, and the lamp flickered once and settled. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it. All the competence and steadiness still present, but something beneath it now. Something that was very human and very hopeful and not trying to be anything other than what it was. "I have been waiting for you to say that," she said. "I was beginning to think I would have to say it myself." He felt something release in his chest, something that had been held for a very long time. And then he did the thing he had been thinking about for approximately 6 weeks, which was to reach across the table and take her hand. She turned her hand under his and held it back, and her fingers were warm and ink-stained and entirely right in his. "Thomas will be insufferable about this," he said. "He already knows," she said. "He told me 2 weeks ago that he had decided you needed help in the emotional department and that he had taken it upon himself to engineer appropriate opportunities." Bernard looked at his son's back, curled over his book in the corner. Thomas's shoulders had a particular set to them that Bernard now recognized as a child pretending he could not hear a conversation. "Thomas," Bernard said. "Yes, Papa," Thomas said without looking up from his book. "Thank you," Bernard said. Thomas looked up then, and his expression in the lamplight was the most purely joyful thing Bernard had ever seen on another human face, and it struck him somewhere so deep and unguarded that he had to look back at Clara, who was smiling at him with that asymmetric smile, one corner higher than the other, and squeezing his hand. The winter that followed was the best one Bernard could remember in years. He came to town more frequently and made less pretense about why, and Clara came to the ranch on days when she had no school, which in the winter months were more plentiful than in the fall, and she and Thomas developed a habit of doing Thomas's lessons at the kitchen table while Bernard worked nearby, coming in and out, sometimes stopping to listen to a passage being read aloud, sometimes asking a question about the lesson with the gusto of a man who had educated himself in the field and had retained a considerable appetite for the formal kind. Clara caught him reading one of her books one afternoon, a natural history of the Western Territories, and she did not tease him about it, just refilled his coffee cup and went back to grading papers, and he felt so settled and content in that moment that he had to look out the window at the cold January sky and remind himself that he was a serious man, and this was a serious feeling, not something lightweight that a person could misplace. He proposed in February. Not in any dramatic fashion. There were no grand gestures. He had thought about grand gestures and decided they were not true to him, and he had come to understand over the months of knowing her that Clara did not want things that were not true to the person offering them. He had been at the school in the late afternoon, one of those lengthening February days when the light lasted a little past 5 and the air had the first tentative warmth of what would eventually become spring somewhere in the distance, and the children had all gone home and Clara was cleaning the chalkboard, and he had come in and she had said, "You are early," and he had said, "I wanted to ask you something," and she had turned from the chalkboard with the chalk eraser still in her hand. "I know I am not a simple man," he said, "and I know the ranch is hard and the Panhandle is harder and neither of us has had an easy time of things. But I know that the winter has been the best one I have had in longer than I want to say, and I know that Thomas is a different child than he was in October, and I know that I am different and most of that is you. Clara," he paused, "I would like you to marry me if you are willing." She set down the chalk eraser. She crossed the room. She put both her hands on his face, which was something she had never done before and which left him entirely without any capacity for words or planning, and she said, "Yes, Bernard, yes." He put his arms around her and held her, there in the empty schoolroom with the afternoon light going gold through the windows and the chalkboard still half covered with the day's lessons, and felt something complete itself. He could not have said precisely what it was, except that it had been incomplete for a long time, and now it was not. They were married in April, when the Texas spring had made the Panhandle briefly and extravagantly beautiful, the mesquite coming into pale green leaf, and the wildflowers opening their yellow and purple faces along every wash and draw, and the sky the particular washed and luminous blue that only appeared in spring before the summer heat burned it into something paler. The whole of Harlan Creek came to the church, because the whole of Harlan Creek had opinions about this wedding, and all of them were favorable now. And Clara had bought a length of cream-colored wool from the general store and made her own dress, simple and well-fitted. And when she walked up the aisle on the arm of her minister father, who had made the journey from Missouri specifically for this purpose, the way she looked at Bernard was the kind of thing that made the older women in the congregation press their handkerchiefs to their eyes, and the older men clear their throats and study the rafters. Thomas was the ring bearer, and he carried out his duties with a solemnity that lasted approximately until the minister pronounced them married, at which point he broke into a grin so wide it seemed to take up his whole face, and he threw his arms around both of them at once, which made the whole congregation laugh and Clara cry, just a little, the good kind. Bernard kissed his wife in front of everyone and felt no self-consciousness about it whatsoever, which was the clearest possible signal that something fundamental in him had changed. The ranch house, in the weeks after the wedding, became a different thing. It was not that Clara changed everything. She was thoughtful about what had been there already, about the ways Bernard had made a home of it, and the ways Thomas had left his particular mark on it. She added things rather than replacing things: a second bookshelf in the parlor, a small herb garden at the kitchen door, a habit of Sunday cooking that left the house smelling like rosemary and wood smoke, and something indefinably right. She and Bernard moved around each other in the kitchen and the yard with the ease of two people who had been thinking about this proximity for a long time and found the reality of it as good as the imagining. Thomas flourished. It was as simple and as profound as that. He stopped fighting entirely, not because he had been told to, but because the thing inside him that had needed to fight had been given somewhere else to go. He read voraciously, everything Clara put in front of him and then more besides, ordering books from the catalog in Amarillo and reading them in the chair that had been Bernard's chair and was now both of theirs, the three of them often in the parlor on evenings, the lamp making its warm circle, Clara with her grading and Bernard with his accounts, and Thomas with whatever book had consumed him that week. Clara continued teaching. The school board had raised an eyebrow when she married, because the convention of the time and place was that married women did not keep teaching positions. But Clara had raised an eyebrow right back at the school board and pointed out that she was the best qualified teacher they had, and that Harlan Creek could not afford to import another one, and that she had no intention of stopping doing something she was called to do simply because her circumstances had changed. Bernard had attended that school board meeting with her, not to speak for her but to be present, standing in the back of the room while she made her case with the same competence and clarity she had used to stop him at her door 6 months prior. And when it was over and the board had voted, somewhat sheepishly, to retain her, he had walked out with her into the April evening and said, "You did not need me there," and she had said, "I know. I wanted you there anyway." He understood the difference. The first year of their marriage was full and productive, and occasionally difficult in the ways that all worthwhile things are occasionally difficult. A hard summer with a cattle sickness that cost them 6 head, and a month of exhausting remediation. A dispute with a neighbor over a water right that required 3 meetings, and the intervention of a county judge before it was resolved. The ongoing negotiation of 2 strong-willed people building a shared life and learning where to yield and where to hold. But the difficulty was the good kind, the kind that left things stronger on the other side, and there was always the evening to come back to, the lamplight and the 3 of them and the ease that had become, by some miracle, ordinary. In the winter of 1879, Clara sat down beside Bernard on the porch on a cold December evening, the stars enormous and indifferent overhead, and put her hand over his and said, "I am going to have a child." Bernard turned to look at her. She was watching him with those clear green eyes, steady and direct, and with something beneath the steadiness that was both certain and slightly wondering, the expression of a person who has known a thing for a little while and is still getting used to the size of it. "Are you certain?" he said. "Quite certain," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the wind came down off the Llano Estacado and moved through the grass, and he put his other hand over hers, covering it completely. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Hopeful," she said. "Somewhat nervous, very much in love with you." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch in the December cold, and Bernard felt the world rearranging itself again, quietly and with purpose, the way it had been doing ever since a Tuesday morning in October when he had climbed 2 steps with fire in his eyes, and a woman had opened a door and changed his direction entirely. Thomas, when told, said, "I knew it," which was not the most gracious response but was entirely in character, and then he said with a sincerity that made both Bernard and Clara have to look away for a moment, "I hope it is a boy. I would like a brother." He paused. "A sister would also be acceptable." "That is very magnanimous of you," Clara said. "I know," said Thomas, and went back to his book. The baby came in August of 1880, on a morning when the heat lay across the Panhandle like a weight and the whole ranch was still except for the sound of the cattle at the water trough and the distant call of a meadowlark. He was a boy, as Thomas had hoped, and he weighed 8 pounds and had Clara's dark auburn hair and Bernard's exact expression of stubborn assessment. And when Bernard held him for the first time in the chair in the parlor, with Thomas peering over his shoulder and Clara watching from the bed across the room, he felt something so large and uncomplicated that it did not have a name, only a feeling, warmth pressed to warmth, present overlapping past. All the years of narrow survival opening, suddenly, into something wide and unembarrassed about its own goodness. They named him James William Boone, the James for Clara's first husband, because Bernard had suggested it and Clara had looked at him with an expression that was everything, all the years of it, and the William for Bernard's father, who had been a man of the Georgia hills and had died when Bernard was 17, and had given him, before he died, the specific quality of stubbornness that had carried Bernard through the worst of it and the best of it alike. Thomas took to his role as older brother with the same focused intensity he applied to everything, which meant that James Boone, from approximately the age of 3 weeks, had a 9-year-old reading to him from the natural history of North American birds and explaining, with extensive citation, why meadowlarks were superior to mockingbirds, and why this opinion was objectively correct. James appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. Harlan Creek grew in those years, the way towns grew in that part of Texas in that era, slowly and then all at once, new families coming in from the east and the south, a second general store, a small hotel, a newspaper that Bernard read with varying degrees of skepticism and Clara read with professional interest. The school grew too, and by 1882 Clara had a second teacher assisting her, a young man just out of the normal school in Austin who was earnest and slightly overwhelmed by Clara's expectations and gradually grew into them, the way most people who worked around her eventually did. Bernard's ranch prospered. The cattle sickness of '79 had been the last major crisis of that kind, and the south pasture fencing held, and he and Hector worked well together and hired 2 more good hands, and the operation ran with the efficiency of something built from the ground up by a man who understood exactly what he was building. But it was not only the ranch that prospered. Bernard himself prospered in the quieter way, in the way of a person who has found what they were missing and found it in a form they had not expected. He became easier to talk to, which people in Harlan Creek noticed and commented on with the frank curiosity of a small community. He laughed more often. He came to social events and stayed. He danced, which he did with increasing competence over the years, and which Thomas eventually declared an embarrassment, not because it was bad but because it was evident that his father enjoyed it, which Thomas, at 13, found mortifying in the way that 13-year-olds find most parental enjoyment mortifying. There was one afternoon in the spring of 1883 that Bernard often returned to in his memory afterward, not because anything extraordinary happened in it, but precisely because nothing extraordinary happened, and it was, in its ordinariness, as perfect as anything he had ever experienced. He had come in from the morning work to find Clara in the garden at the kitchen door, teaching James, who was almost 3, the names of the herbs, pressing the boy's small fingers gently into the rosemary so he would know it by smell as well as sight. James was repeating the names back with that particular solemnity of a child who has decided that learning is serious business, which was a disposition that both his parents recognized, and neither of them could entirely explain. And Thomas was sitting on the kitchen step doing the reading that Clara had assigned, and the spring sun was warm on the red clay, and the distant creek was running high from the snowmelt, and making its sound under everything. And Bernard stood at the corner of the house and watched his family in the garden, and felt the fullness of it press against the inside of his chest like something trying to get out. Clara looked up and saw him standing there, and she did not say anything, only held his gaze for a moment with everything in her face that was usually quieter, all the love and the knowledge of what they had built and what it had cost and what it had been worth. And then she said, "There is coffee on the stove." And he went in and poured it and came back out and sat on the step with Thomas and watched James repeat the herb names, and it was enough and more than enough, and all of it was true. Thomas Boone grew into exactly the formidable young man Clara had predicted. He finished his schooling in Harlan Creek with a record that Clara graded with perhaps slightly more objectivity than she applied to the other students, and then he went east to study law in Austin, because he had decided, somewhere around the age of 12, that he intended to be a lawyer, and nothing that had happened between 12 and 17 had changed his mind. He left on a September morning in 1888 on the eastbound stage, with 2 trunk cases and a box of books, which felt to Bernard like a kind of homecoming to the beginning of the story. And Bernard shook his hand on the stage platform with a formality that made Thomas, 17 and trying to be composed about it, almost lose his composure entirely. And then Clara kissed the boy's forehead and said, "You are going to be magnificent." And Thomas, who had tried very hard to be 17 about all of this, put his arms around his stepmother and held on for a long moment before he climbed aboard the stage and was gone. James, watching from his father's side, said, "Will he come back?" "Every chance he gets," Bernard said. And it was true. In 1885, 3 years before Thomas left for Austin, Clara had given Bernard a daughter. She came in March, small and fierce and red-haired in a way that neither of her parents was, quite, which prompted a great deal of unscientific discussion about the genetics of auburn hair, and whether her maternal grandmother, who Clara described as having had hair the color of autumn leaves, was responsible. They named her Eleanor, and when Bernard first said the name aloud in the small hours of the March night, holding the baby in the parlor while Clara slept, he felt the weight of the original Eleanor, his first wife, Thomas's mother, settle into something that was no longer grief and not yet entirely anything else, but was peaceful. He felt, in some way he could not have articulated, that this was not a replacement but a continuation, that Eleanor was still present in Thomas's dark eyes and in this small red-haired child who shared her name, and that the warmth Clara had brought to the house had not displaced that presence but had made room for it. He said this to Clara, clumsily, on a morning when little Eleanor was 3 weeks old and Bernard was trying to explain something he could not quite reach the edges of, and Clara had taken both his hands and said, "I know. I think of James sometimes, not with grief the way it used to be, but with something like gratitude, that he was there and that he mattered, and that what I learned from loving him helped me know how to love you." She paused. "The people we have loved do not leave when we love someone new. They just find a different place to live." He held on to that. He held on to it for years. Eleanor Boone grew into her name with a cheerful ferocity that made Thomas, on his visits home from Austin, say that she was unquestionably her mother's daughter, which Clara accepted as the compliment it was. She had James's sociability and Bernard's stubbornness and Clara's precision, and she had opinions about everything, and stated them without apology from approximately the age of 4. She was going to be remarkable, and everyone who encountered her at any age could see it plainly. And Bernard, watching her argue some point of geography with her mother at the kitchen table, sometimes saw Eleanor Sr. in the set of her chin, and felt the world's strange and intricate continuity. James became a rancher, which surprised no one, in partnership with his father, which surprised no one either. He had Bernard's love of the land and Clara's patience, and a talent for the practical management of animals and terrain that revealed itself early and grew consistently. At 15, he was already Bernard's most reliable hand, better than men twice his age at reading the weather and the cattle and the long flat horizon, and Bernard had begun, sometime around James's 14th year, to think of the ranch not as something he had built but as something he was handing on, which was a different and more satisfying kind of thinking. By 1890, Harlan Creek was a proper town, with a courthouse and a school district and a new church with a bell tower and paved boardwalks along the main street that Thomas found gratifying and Bernard found unnecessary but accepted. The Boone Ranch was one of the most established operations in the county, known for its good stock and its reliable quality, and for the fact that Bernard Boone ran it with the same fundamental principles he had always run it with: fairness to the men who worked there, and respect for the land and the animals, and the understanding that the land was borrowed from the future and had to be cared for accordingly. Hector still worked there, 20-something years in now, more family than hired man, and his wife Maria made the Christmas tamales that had become as fixed a feature of the Boone December as the tree itself. Clara taught at the Harlan Creek School until 1892, when the school district consolidated and the building they had planned for years was finally built, larger and better equipped, and the school board offered her the position of principal supervisor, which was a newly created role and came with more administrative responsibility and less direct teaching. She took it, and she was very good at it, and she missed the direct teaching in the specific way that you miss something that was exactly right for you in a particular time, with the understanding that the new thing is also right for this new time, and that the world is generous enough to offer both. On an evening in the late autumn of 1893, Bernard and Clara sat on the porch of the ranch house in the October dusk, which had a way of being almost exactly the same shade of gold every year at this particular time, the cottonwoods along the creek going amber, the sky enormous and clear, the air carrying the first serious edge of cold. James was in the barn finishing up the last of the evening tasks with a thoroughness that would have satisfied even the most demanding version of Bernard's younger self. Eleanor was inside doing her homework with the focused fury she brought to everything, and Thomas was in Austin, which he had made his home after finishing his law degree, practicing with a firm there, and engaged to a quiet, intelligent woman named Ruth, who Clara had met twice and approved of emphatically. Bernard had his coffee, Clara had hers, and they sat in the particular ease of two people who had been sitting beside each other for 15 years and had not yet run out of things to notice about the other. "Do you know what I thought?" Clara said, "the first time I saw you coming up the steps. You thought I was going to be difficult," he said. "I thought you were going to be exactly the kind of difficult that most people give up on," she said, "and I thought that was a shame because the kind of difficulty you were carrying was the kind that meant something. It meant you cared about things. It meant the things that hurt you actually mattered to you." She paused. "I thought, here is a man who does not know yet that all that weight he is carrying could be shared." He looked at her. The October light was doing what it always did to her hair, finding the auburn in it and making it burn. She was 43 years old, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, not because the years had not touched her, but because they had, and what they had left was truer than what had been there before. "I thought," he said, "that you were the most inconveniently formidable person I had ever encountered, and that it was going to be a significant problem." "Was it?" she asked, smiling. "Yes," he said. "It was the best problem I ever had." She laughed, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for 15 years, with the ease of something that had found its fit and stayed there. The evening moved over the Panhandle in its ancient way, the stars emerging one by one in the enormous sky, the creek making its sound far down the bank, the lamp coming on in the kitchen window where Alina was working, a small warm square against the vast and generous dark. Thomas married Ruth in the spring of 1894 in Austin, and the whole family went down for it. Bernard and Clara and James, and Alina in their best clothes on the eastbound stage. Thomas meeting them at the depot with Ruth on his arm, and that same grin he had had at age 9, when he watched his father and his teacher hold hands for the first time. The wedding was small and full of good feeling, and Ruth, up close and over the course of several days, proved to be exactly what Thomas needed, calm and exact, and with a dry humor that balanced his intensity perfectly. And Clara watched the two of them during the ceremony with the expression of a woman who has had a hand in something and is deeply satisfied with how it turned out. Thomas came home for the Christmases, and Ruth with him, and eventually children with him. First a daughter they named Clara, which made the elder Clara have to sit down for a moment and collect herself, and then twin boys who were, by all accounts, exactly as manageable as two Boone men under 3 years old could be expected to be, which was to say formidably unmanageable and entirely beloved. James ran the ranch with Bernard through the 1890s, and in 1897, when Bernard was 53 and had developed a slight but persistent cough that Dr. Harmon in town said was not serious but warranted less time in the cold, James took the full operational responsibility of it with a competence that made Bernard feel the deep and particular satisfaction of something completed well, a life's work passed on in the best possible condition to the best possible hands. He was not stepping back entirely. He still rode the south fence line on mornings when the weather was good, and he still had the final word on the major decisions. But he was, for the first time since he had borrowed the money to buy the land in the spring of 1869, not carrying the full weight of it alone. Alina went east to school in 1899, to a women's normal school in San Antonio, with the declared intention of becoming a teacher, which made Clara press her lips together against a smile, and Bernard look at the ceiling with the expression of a man who recognizes in other people the things that are most purely themselves. She was 18 and determined and entirely ready for it, and the morning she left was as hard as the morning Thomas had left 11 years before, and as necessary, and as full of the specific pride that comes from watching someone become what they were meant to be. Bernard and Clara were alone in the house for the first time in their marriage that autumn, which was a strange and in many ways lovely thing, the quiet of the house at a different register than before, full of a different kind of fullness, the accumulated evidence of years everywhere you looked, the books and the photographs and the depth worn into the chair cushions, and the marks on the doorframe where they had measured the children's heights every birthday, James's marks going up and up in that steady rancher's way. Alina's in quick, unpredictable jumps, Thomas's measured in pencil before they were his family, and then continued in a different hand afterward. On an evening in October of 1899, 21 years exactly from the morning that Bernard had ridden into Harlan Creek with fire in his eyes and his jaw set like iron, he and Clara sat on the porch in the October dusk, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going amber, and the sky was the same blue it had always been, enormous and unrepeatable and exactly the same. "I was going to pull him out of school," Bernard said. "I know," Clara said. "You stopped me at the door." "I did." He shook his head slowly, and the smile on his face was the kind that a person carries when they have thought about something from every angle and arrived at nothing but gratitude. "What would have happened," he said, "if you had just let me through?" Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The creek murmured below, and the first stars of the evening appeared in the east, and somewhere in the barn James was singing something low and tuneless while he finished the evening feeding, a habit he had gotten from his father and would never acknowledge. Thomas would have missed his arithmetic lesson, she said, and his essay on conflict resolution and a great many other things. And I would have missed the most obstinate, most capable, most entirely worthwhile man I have ever met. She turned to look at him, and the October light was in her eyes, clear and green and certain. "I was not about to let that happen, Bernard." He took her hand. She held it. The stars came out, one by one, over the Texas Panhandle, over the creek and the cottonwoods and the white schoolhouse at the end of the main street of Harlan Creek, over the ranch that Bernard had built from borrowed money and a refusal to quit, over all of it, generous and indifferent and brilliantly present. And Bernard Boone sat on his porch in the October evening with his wife's hand in his hand, and the warmth of the house behind them, and everything, every single thing. Resolved and complete and full, and was, without any reservation at all, entirely happy. Inside, the lamp was on in the parlor. Outside, the night was clear. The land ran flat and enormous in every direction, the way it always had, the way it always would, holding its people small and enormous at the same time, the way land does when it is truly yours, not by deed alone but by the years of it, the roots of it, the love of it going down and down through everything into something that does not have a name but has a feeling, and the feeling is home. And home is the thing you build, and the thing you are given, and the thing you become when you stop being alone in it. The wind came down off the high plains and moved through the grass and lifted the edge of Clara's shawl, and she pulled it closer, and Bernard put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together in the October dark under the vast and faithful stars, and the story was complete, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.